Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matt Marshall. I'm the Director of Student Services here for the Cotati-Rohnert Park Unified School District. And tonight we have a presentation for you about opioid and fentanyl information. And one of the reasons we're bringing this to you is I think we do a good job with drug and alcohol education with our students. But we don't know what the parents know and don't know. And so this is really a family presentation. And so we know a lot of families at home are probably watching via YouTube live, which is fantastic. Please know that we are going to record this presentation, and the presentation will be posted on our website in English and Spanish in just a few days. And the reason we're bringing this presentation forward is many of you heard about the terrible deaths of two high school students in Santa Rosa a month ago, and this really brought home the point of how important understanding opioids and fentanyl in our community is for everybody. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our very special guest speaker, Dr. Sarah Ferraro Cunningham. She is a licensed psychologist specializing in substance use in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Cunningham's passion for effective and innovative substance use prevention led her to co-found Panaptic and develop Panaptic's impact prevention programs, which Cotati-Rohnert Park uses. Dr. Cunningham's expertise and passion for prevention led her to being selected to join the inaugural year of the Innovation to Impact Fellowship at Yale University. Innovation to Impact, founded through a collaboration between Yale University and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that's NIDA, brings together leaders in substance use prevention and research across the country with the goal of impacting the national substance use crisis. Dr. Cunningham has developed her expertise to nationally recognized research projects on early intervention for teens and young adults struggling with substance use and resides in Sonoma County with her husband and two children. And with that, I'll let Dr. Cunningham take it away. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for finding the time to be here today and to talk about a topic that is really incredibly important in our community and across the country right now. So I wanted to just share a little bit about my work, what we're going to talk about today, and what I hope will be useful for you as you move forward. So in our work at Panaptic, one of the things that we believe in our hearts is that effective prevention of problems with drugs and alcohol, it's a community and collective effort. So if any of you are watching today with your family present, or if you are in conversation today and thinking about people you can connect with, or folks that you can share some of the information that you learned with, those are the things that we can do to make a difference. So my goals today are to share some quick facts with you about opioids, which is a class of substances that in regular life we often call painkillers. We're going to talk about fentanyl and how we can understand it and know how, where it's found and how to be mindful of fentanyl's presence in our community. We're also going to talk about a reality that is very true for many of us, and that all of us need to be aware of the risk of overdose to opioids and fentanyl. So we'll talk about how to recognize if overdose is happening, how to respond, and then ideally the steps that we can take together to prevent overdose or problems with opioids and fentanyl. So we will be spending a lot of our time thinking about how collectively as a community we can protect young people, how we can have conversations that matter, that can save a life, and some actionable steps that we can take together. So the one thing I would say, and decades and decades of prevention research highlights this, which is that if we have one conversation with someone that we care about, if we bring up a tricky topic that can be hard to talk about with our kids or our neighbors or with our family or with friends, that can actually save lives. And so as you, or if you have questions today, please let me know. I definitely want to make sure that this is helpful for you and meaningful for you today. Hola, buenas. Hi. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about opioids and fentanyl, just to have a sense of what we're talking about when we say opioids, what that includes. So opioids are a class of drugs, again, that we often call painkillers, that originally were naturally derived from the poppy plant. Opioids are really helpful. They impact the brainstem and our spinal cord, and they relax the body. They actually impact the centers of our brain that involve sensations of pain, both physical pain and emotional pain. But they work also because they slow down our breathing, they slow down our heart rate, they help our body to relax, which in turn also alleviates pain. Opioids, if we take them, prescribed by a doctor to us. So if we have a surgery or if we have an injury, or for a short period of time we are coping with intense pain, if we take that prescription from our doctor to us as prescribed for a short period of time, generally we're just fine. If we take someone else's prescription, if we take more than we're prescribed, or if we take them for a long time, we can experience some negative effects. I wanted to also talk about fentanyl. So fentanyl is an opioid. It's a synthetic opioid. And so synthetic opioid means that it's made in labs. For those that are coming in, come on in and grab a seat wherever you would like. So synthetic means it's made in a lab, or it could be made in the unregulated drug industry. Fentanyl is an incredibly powerful synthetic opioid. Historically, it was used to treat really intense pain that other medications couldn't help. The thing to know about fentanyl is that different studies say different things, but it's anywhere from 30 to 100 times stronger than heroin, or 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, which used to be the strongest painkiller that could be prescribed. And the thing to know about about fentanyl is that it is really easy to make, and it's also very inexpensive to make. And so it is, found in a lot of drugs around. And the other thing is that it's a really versatile substance. So fentanyl can be in crystal form, it can be in a powder form, it can be in liquid, like in nasal sprays or dropped onto blotter paper. It can also be pressed into pills. So locally, in drug seizures, fentanyl has been found in pills that look like pills that are pressed that say Xanax or that say Percocets. So when drug dealers in the unregulated drug trade, pills are created, sometimes they can be laced with fentanyl also. And when we connect with the police departments in our county and look at what drugs have been found to be laced with fentanyl, it's a whole lot. So fentanyl has been found in methamphetamines, it's been found in cocaine, it's been found in pressed pills like Xanax or Adderall. It's also been found in pressed opioid pills like Vicodin or Percocets and heroin, and also in drugs like MDMA or Molly or ecstasy. It's also been found in some cannabis products. Thank you. That's a great question. So the question was, why is fentanyl being mixed with narcotics when maybe 20 years ago that wasn't the case? I think, honestly, it's because fentanyl is so inexpensive and easy to make that the unregulated drug trade, if people are looking for something strong that creates a really big high, fentanyl, even in very small amounts, is really effective at that. And so in the unregulated drug trade, or like going to see a drug dealer, you get a lot of return customers if they feel like the high is really profound. And so we're seeing more and more and more fentanyl. I also think because very small amounts have a big impact, it's easier to sneak fentanyl in. It's easier to traffic fentanyl because you don't need a lot to have a big effect. It's a great question. Were there any other questions about fentanyl before I moved forward? No. Okay. I should have said this earlier, but I am someone that if I have a question and wait till the end, I won't remember it. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will gladly pause and make sure to answer what's on your mind. So locally, fentanyl has been found in a lot of different substances. And I wanted to talk about why it's so important to learn about opioids, to learn about fentanyl when we think about the risk for overdose. So unlike most substances, opioids affect the spinal cord and the brainstem. Those are what we consider very primitive parts of the brain. They affect our whole system. And what happens is that they slow down the whole body. Even taking one dose of an opioid, our breathing slows down. Our heart rate slows down. And that is part of why opioids have the effect that they do. And that is also part of why overdose is such a risk. Because if we take too much, the body slows down so much that it stops working. And that's actually what happens when we overdose. And when we think about how opioids impact the brain, just want to make sure they all came up. Opioids impact parts of the brain involved in our pleasure centers as well. Oh, sorry, I hit that too quickly. There we go. And what they do is they create this feeling of euphoria. And if any of you know someone who has struggled with their opioid use, or if you yourself have taken opioids, sometimes what people, and if you're in intense pain, you may not notice this as much, but when people have taken them, for fun, what they'll say is it feels really calm and enjoyable and safe. And that euphoria that comes with opioid use is really attractive. But what's interesting is that because the parts of our brain that are impacted, the brainstem and the spinal cord and the pleasure centers of our brain, the body gets addicted to opioids very, very quickly. We actually get dependent on them physically, even within a couple of weeks. And what happens to the brain over that period of time is that it becomes harder and harder and harder to feel emotionally or physically okay without the presence of the drug in the system. And to answer your that great question about why fentanyl is so present, and another piece of it is that when we take it, if it takes more and more to feel right or okay, often folks seek it out more and more and more because of how it impacts the brain so quickly. And some of the things that happen in the short term, they're very effective for relieving pain. A side effect of that is sometimes it can calm our anxiety. When we use it in a medical setting, or if we're prescribed it for a short time, that's fine. We're fine generally. But what you might see if someone is taking opioids or even taking too much is it really impacts our whole system. You may notice that someone has, we call it like contracted pupils, like really small pupils. Sometimes folks will get nauseous or itchy skin when they're using them. Their breathing will slow down or get more erratic, and often folks will nod off when they're under the effects of opioids, and that's in the short term. In the long term, what we see is that opioids are an incredibly addictive substance. And because fentanyl is so much stronger, again, it's 30 to 100 times stronger than heroin, that addictive process happens much, much faster. And so what we see for young people, for teenagers, is that 1 in 4 teenagers who try opioids will struggle with what we call in my field a substance use disorder or an addiction. And that's, 25% is a pretty high number. And a lot of people who try fentanyl for the first time don't do it intentionally. They may be intending to use a different substance, but that fentanyl is still present. And so that addictive potential is really high. And what I think can happen is over time, the body needs more and more and more to have the same result. We call that developing a tolerance. And with opioids and fentanyl, as our tolerance builds, the body needs more and more and more to feel okay. And if we don't have that drug in our system, what happens is we begin to go in withdrawal. And withdrawal from opioids is very uncomfortable. It is not lethal, but it is uncomfortable. Often folks will feel incredibly anxious. They may feel like they have the worst flu they've ever had in their lives. There's often aches and pains, like restless limbs, a lot of nausea and vomiting. And I think because it does impact those primitive parts of our brain, there is a really strong desire to use again to feel okay. And when we think about addiction, there's a psychiatrist that I love. His name is Dr. Gabor Mate. And what he often says is that those of us who struggle with addiction don't want to suffer. We don't want to be in that position. But what tends to happen is that we need that drug to feel okay. The drug begins to feel like safety. And I think that when we think about opioids and fentanyl, that is often very true. And for those of us who love someone who might be struggling with their use, it's very hard to see, and we might think, why are you doing this? It's so risky. But when someone is in that process, they don't usually see how risky things are getting. It's impossible to see anything other than wanting to feel okay and safe again. And so what we see with opioids and fentanyl is that really huge risk for addiction. And the earlier that we start using, the more likely it is that we may struggle. So we all know in our community here that we have lost young people even recently to fentanyl. And what we're seeing across the country is that there is a big risk of overdose for opioids and fentanyl. And so when I think about the greatest risks associated with opioid use, the biggest one is death. What can happen with overdose if we take too much, or even a little if our body isn't used to it, especially a little bit of fentanyl, our body shuts down. We begin to slow down so much. The breathing slows. We don't get enough oxygen to the brain. Our heart rate slows, and eventually it all stops. And that is what happens whenever we experience an overdose. I did want to share, and I will in a moment talk about overdose. I'll also want to spend most do to prevent problems with opioids and fentanyl. But I did want to share something that is also very important. So there's a term called synergistic effects. And what that means is sometimes when people use two substances together, that the effect is way greater than you would think. So instead of 2 + 2 = 4, it's like 2 + 2 = 20. And this happens a lot with opioid use. And so if we think about opioid use and alcohol use, the combined effect is actually 10 to 20 times stronger. Because with opioid use, the breathing slows down, we get less oxygen in the body, less oxygen in the brain. Alcohol is actually a depressant. And so with that, the body slows down too, and our breathing slows, and we get less oxygen to the brain. And so sometimes if someone were taking a pill that might contain fentanyl, or a different drug that might contain fentanyl and alcohol, the risk for overdose is that much greater. The risk is also greater if we were to use a stimulant medication. So for in some cases like cocaine or methamphetamines, or even like medicines that are sometimes prescribed for ADD or ADHD, like Ritalin or Ativan, what happens there is the opioids slow down our breathing, we get less oxygen to the brain, but stimulants actually require us to have more oxygen. Stimulants make our heart rate go up. They make us, we need more oxygen in our system when that happens. And so combining stimulants with fentanyl is also 10 to 20 times stronger, and that increases our risk of overdose pretty dramatically. So as I had mentioned, we did lose a number of our community members most recently. I will tell you, as someone that speaks at high schools across the country, I also speak at high schools a lot locally here in Sonoma County. I live in Sonoma County myself. I have not yet been to a school where someone has not overdosed unintentionally to fentanyl in the last year. Overdose is the leading cause of death for people aged 18 to 44. So that means young people are dying more from overdose than they are from car accidents or from illnesses or from other things that could take our lives away. And the scary part is that the rate of adolescents overdosing to fentanyl is increasing much, much more than adults. And so this is a problem that's impacting our young people and our friends in our community the most. And so for all of us, I think there are two things I think of. One is with friends, with family members, with community members, we have to have these conversations, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But for all of us, I also think we need to know how to detect overdose and how to respond if overdose were to happen. I hope none of us in this room or watching at any point in time ever encounter someone who has overdosed. But having met and talked with folks who overdosed who were able to survive, one of the things that I know is knowing what it is and responding quickly is the thing that could save someone's life. So, locally here, it's just worth knowing that locally in Sonoma County, 92% of our overdose deaths have had fentanyl present. So one thing I will talk about is how to talk about fentanyl. Just for context, in other places like the state of New York, the percentage of overdoses that are due to fentanyl is 70%. But here it's 92%, and that is because fentanyl is really infiltrated the drug supply here. And so for any friends, for any family members, it's really important that we talk about fentanyl because it's very, very widely available. And if you were to look at those crystals on the tip of a pencil, that is the amount of fentanyl that is required to overdose. What they say is that it's about 2 to 3 grains of salt. The thing to know about this is that fentanyl does not have a smell. Fentanyl does not have a look. And so you can't inspect a drug that you're preparing to use and try to figure out if it has fentanyl. It's really important. It just takes the tiniest bit. And usually drugs are way bigger than 2 to 3 grains of salt, but it just takes that tiny amount to cause a lethal overdose. So I wanted to talk about how to recognize if someone were overdosing. So one of the things that you might notice is very slow or no breathing. Or sometimes someone might breathe in a really erratic way, so not consistently, where it might be one breath and then a really long time until you can detect another breath, where you see someone's breathing is impaired. Another sign is pinpoint pupils. So one of the things that happens to our eyes when we use opioids is that the pupils, the black parts, get really, really small. And if someone is overdosed to opioids, it's very tiny. And that, if you see that, is a huge indicator that someone needs help, that they're likely overdosing to opioids. Their skin might be pale or gray or ashen, and typically their body is really limp. They may look asleep or like they passed out. Usually folks, if you try to rouse them, or sometimes programs will tell you to pinch their shoulder, between their neck and their shoulder, really hard to see if they'll move. But if someone isn't responding, that is a big sign. And then lastly, you might notice kind of like liquidy sounds when they're breathing or gurgling, or not noticing a pulse or a heartbeat. All of those could be signs of another medical problem, but if we were to come across someone with these symptoms, we want to respond as if they're overdosing to opioids because we could take some fast action that could save their lives. And the fast action, there are two big steps that I'll talk about. One is call 911. And I wanted to share this for any young people in the room or young people who are watching because I was trying to think about myself. And if I were to call 911, if I'm concerned about someone, and maybe I was using drugs or maybe I was drinking, I would be scared about that. And what I wanted to share is that there is a law in California, it's called the Good Samaritan Law, that protects people for calling 911 if they suspect that an overdose is happening. And what that means is that, say, the person who called is underage, but they've been drinking. Or say the room that everybody is in has a lot of drugs, and everybody is under the influence. The police will not press charges on anyone else who's present if they call to save someone's life for a potential overdose. They are also not allowed to look into things like immigration status or other legal concerns that could be happening in the home. They just attend to that overdose. And so the law is on our side should we need to call. The other thing I wanted to share about is that there is an amazing substance called Narcan. Narcan, also known as naloxone, is a nasal spray. It is amazing because what it can do is temporarily reverse an opiate overdose. And the other amazing thing about it is that say you were to give someone Narcan and maybe they had a heart attack but weren't overdosing, it won't hurt them. You really cannot hurt someone by giving them Narcan if they're not overdosing. If they are overdosing, it will give them about 45 minutes to an hour to say it'll reverse the overdose and let them get emergency help. So Narcan is a substance that I know is in every single one of our schools here in Sonoma County. If there were an overdose at school, the faculty have Narcan on site. It's also free most places. And if you are a young person or a minor, your doctor or other providers don't have to tell your parents that you got naloxone or Narcan. So people can get it for free from their pediatrician. They can get it for free from a variety of areas in Sonoma County, and I'll be sharing a list of those places where you can confidentially and free of cost get Narcan. There's also some great websites where you can have it mailed to you. And what I would suggest is that regardless of whether or not you're someone who uses opioids or knows friends who are using opioids or fentanyl, it's just a good thing to have. Because should you come across someone who's overdosing, it could save their life. So one thing I wanted to share about the steps is that tied for first place are calling 911 and administering Narcan. The reason that they are tied for first place is that one without the other doesn't work as well. So if somebody were to administer Narcan, say they were to spray it, and sometimes what'll happen is that the person who's overdosed revives. They could have a whole conversation with you and seem very normal. But what happens when about 45 minutes later to an hour later is that overdose returns. And so if we were to administer Narcan and think, they're okay, but not call 911, that person will die later because the overdose comes back. So we always have to do both. The other thing we can do is keep the person awake and talk to them, and then also sort of lay them on their side and wait for the emergency personnel to arrive. I'm going to show a brief video, and then I just want to check in and see if anyone had questions about Narcan. And just to say, the reason I wanted to show this is that sometimes I think we talk about how to do things without actually showing what it would be like, and I think it's really important. For any of you who would want to learn more or find out where you could get Narcan for free, this site, vaxfightfentanyl.org, is actually an excellent, excellent site. Did anybody have any questions about Narcan or overdose before we switch gears? No? Okay. So, that is the bad news portion of what I wanted to talk about. And I think that I'm a believer that it's no good to just share the bad news. It's really important to talk about how can we come together. And when we're thinking about overdose and opioids and fentanyl's presence in our community, what I want to say is this, that each of us has a role to play. If we are 16 or we are 65, we have an equal role to play in protecting our community and protecting our family members and friends. Because most people who overdose to fentanyl aren't aware that that is a risk. And so I wanted to talk first about what the research tells us. So the research tells us that even one conversation about substance use with a friend, one conversation about substance use with your kids or with a cousin, that actually changes the trajectory of somebody's life. So you don't even have to talk about it a lot, though more than one conversation is sometimes great and better too, but even just one makes a world of difference. So when we think about prevention for opioids and fentanyl, I'm just going to get this all here. Okay. There are two things to think of for prevention. One is what we call environmental prevention. That's what can we do in our homes to reduce the risk that somebody will find or use opioids. 85% of young people who try opioids try it out of somebody's medicine cabinet for the first time. So if we think about what's the best way to help kids not to use or to make sure nobody gets into a potentially dangerous substance, it can involve clearing out our medicine cabinets. So if you do take opioid medications, it is a great idea to keep them somewhere secure. Sometimes people put them in a little lockbox, not even for their own kids, but because sometimes people are in and out of the house and they want to make sure that nobody can access them. Another great thing that we can do is dispose of medications when we're done with them. So I am actually someone who does not respond well to painkillers. They totally bum me out. They make me miserable. And so if I had a surgery or if I had something like a procedure or an injury, I would probably have a lot left in that medicine bottle. And sometimes, not as much now, but in the past, doctors would prescribe for a while, even more than we needed, just in case. And so a lot of times we can have extra medications, or for especially folks who are older, sometimes the elderly are prescribed more, and so at a grandparent's medicine cabinet, there can be more present. And so there are amazing places in Sonoma County where you can dispose of unused medicines safely. So we don't generally want to throw them in the garbage or flush them down the toilet because that influences our water supply, amongst other things. But you can take them to basically any police department, and they will help you get rid of the medication safely. There's also a great site, which is safemedicinedisposal.org, where you can look and see where is a place near you I can drop off medications. The other thing that I think is important to talk about in our families is that even if something is a medicine, it doesn't mean it's safe for us. So a medicine that was prescribed to my uncle after a surgery isn't risk-free for me if I wanted to try it or to take it. So one thing we can talk about with our friends, with your families, is even if a medicine is in a medicine bottle, you have to be careful. And I will say that even if a pill is in a medicine bottle with somebody's name on it, that does not mean it doesn't contain fentanyl. Because sometimes people will put different pills in a medicine bottle. And so we have to talk about how medicine is only safe if it's prescribed to you and you're in communication with the doctor and taking it as prescribed. Otherwise, it can get really slippery very quickly. And if you are a teenager, oh, yes, please go ahead. Amazing. So, since a lot of these are police agencies, and sometimes we may feel comfortable going there, sometimes not, that Safeway Pharmacy has a great drop-off box as well. Thank you. One of the things that I think is common is sometimes if you may have a friend or you yourself might get injured. And what we see is that for kids, for teenagers who are prescribed opioids for pain, that increases the risk pretty dramatically of struggling with opioid use over time. It does not mean that if we need a painkiller medication, we don't take it. But what I would say is that for any of you, if you are ever prescribed opioid medications for health reasons, or if any parents or family members in the room, if the kids in your life are prescribed them, it's important to have these conversations and to check in regularly about how they're feeling. And when they stop the medication, how they're doing. There are methods that can make the, stopping a painkiller medication less difficult for the body and for the mind. And so if someone is struggling, I'd much rather them get help from their pediatrician than go down the street and get help and begin suffering from an opioid use problem. So when we say one conversation can change the game for someone, I think it's important to talk about what are the things that actually help these conversations to work. And when we have prevention conversations, and what that means is just talking to someone before there's a problem. That is actually the best time to talk about drugs, is before you're worried about someone. So it's never too early, and it's also never too late. So my oldest kid is 9, and I've started talking to her about fentanyl and opioids. I've started talking to her about other substances, the light version, but just, there are pills out there that can be really dangerous for people. You always want to be careful about what medicines you take. So there's never a time it's too early. But when we have these brave conversations, usually, especially if it's friend to friend, so if you are a young person in this room and you're thinking about talking to a friend about fentanyl or anything else, that's a tough conversation. If you're a parent or another adult loved one, it can make us nervous to think about talking to our kids because we don't want to get it wrong. And usually these kind of difficult topics are uncomfortable. And so what I would say is some of the best things that we can do are what they say to set the stage for a successful conversation. What that means is waiting until a time where you're kind of calm and where the person that you want to talk to, whether it's a friend or a kid, is calm too. Or a parent, by the way. Sometimes we as young people want to talk to our parents. If we're racing around, if somebody has a big test or a big game the next day, that might not be the best time. But if there is a 15-minute window where things are kind of chill, or if usually you talk about things at the dinner table or on the car ride to practice or whatever it might be, those are moments that can really make a difference. And what I would say is if you're nervous to have the conversation, that's normal. And what I would say is it's helpful to share that. So I might say, if I'm a parent, I might say, hey, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. I'm sure you've heard about the teenagers in our area that died because of a fentanyl overdose, and I just want to talk about that for a little bit because I care about you. But I got to tell you, I'm kind of uncomfortable. I don't have all the answers, but I love you, so I want to talk about it, right? If you were talking to a friend, you can say, hey, I heard about this. What do you think about it? I know it can be kind of different, or weird for us to talk about, but what do you think about fentanyl? Right? We can bring it up in a casual way, but if we're nervous, it's best to say it because what will happen is people will pick up on what we're feeling. They just may misread it. They, may misread it as judgment or agitation. So if we're nervous, it's best to say so. The other thing is that, and this is more for parents talking to kids or caring adults talking to young people, I think it's really important. Sometimes when I'm nervous to have a conversation on a tricky topic, I launch right into it. And what I might skip are the nice things, like what I appreciated about them that day, or how proud I am of them for their teacher conference and what I heard, or how hard I see them working at reading or in history class or whatever else is true. The truth is that if we skip that part of letting people know that we see them, that we see these amazing things that they're doing, it makes it really hard for them to listen to us. When I think about talking friend to friend, that works too, right? We don't have to say, I just want to let you in on the amazing things you're doing, but you can say, hey, I saw you out there on the field yesterday and you looked amazing. Or I really appreciate how you don't care about what other people think of you, right? Whatever is true, we can say that. It lets people know that we see them as a person and we're not just trying to talk at them. And then what I think can be helpful is to make sure that, well, this one I'm going to actually come back to. That skipped ahead for me. Sorry. My apologies. I'm going to skip this for a second. But what we want to do is share little bits of information. So if it were me, I would say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about fentanyl, or I've been thinking a lot about these kids who've overdosed. And can we talk about it? I think when we ask permission for a conversation, it makes a world of difference. Every time I say this, parents in the room say, whoa, 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 whoa. If I ask permission, my kid's not going to talk to me. They're going to say, no, I don't want to talk about this. But the truth is we can ask. And if somebody says no, then I might say, well, when's a good time? Because this is important. I want to talk to you about it. But the truth is, if we don't ask, we may barge in on a really bad day. We may come at a moment where their mind is somewhere else. And so we always want to ask. And what I would say when we share information, like if you wanted to share information about how many overdoses were due to fentanyl or what drugs have been found to contain fentanyl in our area, we also can ask about that and say, hey, I learned some things. Or if you're a young person talking to a friend, you can say, hey, I learned some things at this talk. Or, I want to share it with you. What do you think? Right? When we ask, we get buy-in in a conversation. It lets the person know we respect them enough to see if they want to talk about it. Sometimes when I talk to friends, I don't realize that they're coping with something I don't know much about. And it wouldn't be surprising if young people have parents or uncles or cousins that they're worried about for fentanyl and opioid use, given what we see in our community. So we always want to ask. If we're a caring adult talking to a teenager, you want to ask so that you can see it like, hey, are you open to hearing about this? And again, my daughter would say no. But then what we can say is, I want to talk about this because I care about you. When in the next 2 days works? And if we show up at the time that works, usually everybody is more open to that conversation. And so I think that's really, really important. I wanted to share some of the traps that we can fall into when we're worried about a topic or when we're worried about someone. And one of them is what we call the information trap. This I might fall into with all of you today. It's this idea that when we share more and more and more about something, like print out all the articles, come with our receipts, ready to talk about it, that it's better. The truth is, most of us have like a 30 to 40 second attention span for information on a tough topic. So we don't need to share it all. We just have to share some information that is important to the person that we're talking to and to us. Another thing that I think is tricky that we always want to watch out for is falling into the lecture trap. This can happen between friends as much as it can happen between a parent or a caring adult and a kid. This is when we're nervous or worried about someone. We are a lot more likely to say, you know what? You need to stay away from that crowd, or you need to focus more on this. You need to make sure you're not around anybody who uses any drugs anytime. Or whatever it is that when we start telling what to do, and this can happen with our friends, with our peers, and anybody else, within 5 seconds, that person stops listening. And what they learn is, I'm not going to talk to you. Doesn't mean that if you're a parent in this room that you don't have rules. What it does mean is that we try to catch ourselves if we start lecturing and back up. That is part of setting the stage for a successful conversation. We catch ourselves if we fall into that trap and say, you know what? I'm getting a little worked up right now because I'm worried about you. Let's come back to this later. Because the lecturing, nobody's going to listen. The other thing that can happen is that we can fall into another trap, which is like labeling. And this, if you're a young person in this room, we can be really prone to if we're worried about somebody's substance use. Like, hey, I think you've got a problem with this. Or, I think that you're screwing up. Or if we're a parent or, a caring adult, we might say like, hey, you don't seem motivated anymore. Or, I think you're using drugs, or whatever it might be. The truth, what tends to happen, not all the time, but I would say 99.9% of the time, if we put a label on something, we're going to have an argument about whether or not that label is true. And the whole point of the conversation will be missed. So sometimes I might say, I don't know, I might even say to my spouse, hey, I don't think you're caring about this as much as me. The conversation will be, am I caring about it as much as you? Instead of, what is this thing that I'm caring about that I wanted to bring up? So we want to be very careful not to label. We'll do it because we're human and we care. But if we do, it's a signal to us, hold on, I got to get myself more grounded and calm before we talk more about this. And this is, I do want to say, for any of you who might be worried about a friend's substance use, when we label, what tends to happen is they try to hide their problem from us more. And so we want to try to steer clear of that as much as we can. Another one is the blaming trap. We can do this a lot when we're worried. The problem is school, or the problem is these people you're hanging out with, or the problem is you have a bad lacrosse coach, or whatever it might be. The problem is you don't care about math anymore. We can have lots of blaming, but what that does is it distracts us from the concern that's really right in front of us, and it can rob us of the chance to have a connection with someone and talk about what's really going on. It doesn't mean that there aren't other factors that could influence what's happening. But if we start blaming, we lose the person we're talking to. We lose focusing on them, and they probably need our help the most. So if you catch yourself there, you're just like me as a human being, but we want to try to stop it. And the last one is taking sides. So it's pretty hard, especially for me as a prevention educator who is deeply concerned about overdose. I'm very concerned about fentanyl and the risk that it poses to people in my community. But even with that, I try not to take a side. Because if we say all drugs are bad, all, if you drink, it means this about you. If we say, fentanyl is in everything. If we say these blanket statements or extreme statements, we tend to get pulled into arguments with the person we're trying to connect with. And then the other thing that happens is if the person disagrees with us, they won't talk to us anymore. Now, if you're a parent and want to have rules about substance use at home, that's different. But if we get pulled into taking sides, this is all good or all bad, if you have friends that are using drugs, that's all bad. Again, what happens is people just start to hide things from us. So I wanted to share a couple steps that we can go through to offer information, because I think it's helpful to think about how can I take home some of what I learned if I want to share about it with friends or with people that I care about. We'll also talk for the parents or families in the room about how do you figure out what your rules are at home or your boundaries and how you can talk about that. And then I also want to step into some other things that we can do and some tools for help. So if I were to share information, the first thing I want to do is just say, hey, I learned about this. You up for talking about it? Doesn't have to be like, I would formally like to ask you permission to talk on this topic, but we could just say, listen, I learned some things I didn't know. Would you be interested in talking about it? Usually a person is going to say yes. If no, we can always, if we're an adult and want to talk to a younger person, we can say when's a different time. Or if you're a friend who's worried about someone in your life, you can say, well, when can we come back to this? And then when the time is right, or if they say yes, we want to share some information. But the trick is, we want to share the 30-second version of the information. So I might say something like, hey, is it okay if I talk to you about something I learned about drugs being laced with fentanyl? The 30-second version would be, a lot of times people think fentanyl is only in opioids or heroin, but I just learned that in our county, it's in almost every drug you could take. It's in weed, it's in cocaine, it's in methamphetamines and other drugs, and even in pills. Right? The quick version. And then the last step is to ask, what did you think about that? I have 2 brothers. Oh, yes. Yeah, they have found, the question was, can fentanyl be found in vape pens? So fentanyl has been found in cannabis concentrates, which is what people are vaping, in the vape pen. Typically, if someone were to buy them direct from a dispensary, that would not be the case because that is more regulated. But usually if you're under 21, you're not going to buy direct from a dispensary. And so sometimes concentrates can have fentanyl in it. I've also talked to a couple teens who believed that in the flower that they were smoking, that might have had some sprinkles of fentanyl in it because they tested positive for fentanyl. I haven't heard as much about that, but I usually trust kids if they tell me. Yeah, great question. Yeah. Any other questions before I switch? Yeah. No? Okay. So I think that checking back is really important. That's actually what makes it a conversation instead of, let me just tell you something. But what do you think about that? And I think that when I think of our family conversations or even conversations with friends, that piece is really important. We want to hear what the other person thinks. I will say, and I think I was starting to say this, I have 2 little brothers. They both live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And one of the things that they make fun of me for, because I'm a psychologist, is they'll say that I talk like a therapist. And so I would probably say something like, oh, well, what do you think about that? Or do you do you have a moment to talk about this topic? We don't have to talk that way. We can use regular talk, and especially if you're a young person and thinking about talking with a friend, I would just talk the way you feel comfortable. But we can still go through, asking questions and seeing what somebody thinks about the information that we shared. Other information that I think can be really helpful to share with a friend is what resources are there for support. So if you were worried about a friend and wanted to share information with them, you could say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you can get help at the counseling at school, and they don't have to tell your parents about what's going on with you. In fact, they're supposed to keep it private, right? We can share information in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be drug specific. So I also wanted to talk about, how do you know if a friend, if a kid, if a young person in your life might be struggling with their substance use? Sometimes with overdose, it just happens. And sometimes overdose happens the first time somebody uses a drug if they don't know that it's laced with fentanyl. And sometimes what we can see is a problem with substance use developing over time. So when we think about what happens when somebody develops a substance use disorder or an addiction, is they start to need more and more to feel the same way. They're going to start feeling awful when they're not using it or drinking. But then some other things start to happen too. Most people, and I've worked for the last 15 plus years in substance use treatment, I've talked with a lot of folks. Most people feel a lot of embarrassment or shame about what's going on for them. Because when we think of what Dr. Gabor Mate said, he said that the substance starts to feel like safety. And it actually impacts centers in our brain and releases brain chemicals. When we develop a problem with substances, they release dopamine, which is a brain chemical that makes us feel good. Some people call it the do it again chemical because dopamine is the one that tells us to eat again. Dopamine is also the one that tells us that if we were starving in a desert, chocolate cake would be better than maybe like raw broccoli, right? Dopamine helps us to survive. And what happens when we have a substance use problem is that the dopamine in our brain tells us to do it again. That's what will make you feel okay. And when someone has a problem with alcohol or drugs, what they end up doing is doing what they need to do to keep drinking or using to try to feel safe, to try to feel okay. And usually it takes, precedence over everything else. So you might see someone not doing as well or not focusing as much on school, for example. You may notice a friend who used to love being in theater or who used to love playing sports or who is super creative and playing their guitar all the time, who is no longer doing those things. They may not say, I don't find it enjoyable anymore, I just want to drink or I just want to get high. They may just say it's boring now. Because in truth, in their brain, changes have happened that have made it less pleasurable to do the things they love. You also may find someone switching friend groups or isolating more, sticking to themselves. And that happens because the more that we use alcohol and other drugs, that shame comes up, and we don't want to be seen for using or drinking that much. We don't want to be seen for struggling. And so we can pull away from the people who know us the best. We can pull away from our family. We can pull away from our closest of friends and end up hanging around with people who may not comment on what's going on or who may not notice because they're drinking and using the same too, right? And so sometimes, whether this is a friend or a kid in your life, you'll see them pulling away. You also may see things like, dropping grades or dropping attendance, not doing as well at the things that they used to do just fine. And another thing you may see is a change in appearance. We care for ourselves less when we're caught in a struggle related to substance use. We don't even have the ability to notice or care for ourselves in the same way. And so those are some of the signs, I think, that could tell you that a kid in your life or a friend in your life is really struggling. Now, I will say that those signs that I just shared with you are also common for mental health problems, like depression or like other mental health concerns. So it's not always a substance use problem, but it can be. And the key is if we have someone in our life, a friend or family member, where we see those changes happen, the sooner we can talk to them, the better. But it's also never too late. So one of the things that we can do is bring it up. But it's helpful to bring it up in a certain kind of way. So if I were concerned about someone in my life, I might say, hey, you know what? I've noticed some changes. You used to be really into watching movies, and I used to see you playing your guitar all the time, but I haven't seen that in a long time. And the best way to describe the changes is to describe them very objectively. We don't want to label them. We don't want to put any meaning into why, but just as if I were watching a movie of your life and I were to see those changes, I would be able to describe it. And the reason that that is helpful is because sometimes that shame and embarrassment will rear its head and try to pull that person into being alone and not seen for the problem that's going on. And if there can be a fight about it, like if we label and then there's a disagreement about the label, that just helps that person to stay stuck. And so if I were thinking about talking to a friend, I might say like, hey, you know what? We used to hang out a lot, and now I see you hanging out with these other folks. And I know that those folks are using drugs more than I do. What's up with that, right? We can just check in a variety of ways, but we want to describe it objectively. If I were to say, I think you're using drugs and don't care about school anymore, then we'll have an argument about that. So the more objective we can be, the better. And I think that what I would say is that if someone is really struggling, they may not say, thank you for bringing this up. I'm so appreciative of the conversation and how much you care about me. I'm ready to get help today. They may not say that. But what you will be teaching them is that you are a person who sees them and cares for them, and if ever they become ready to get help, you are the person they can go to. And this is really important, especially if you are a young person thinking about talking to a friend. My colleague who I created our organization Panoptic with often shares, he's someone who's been sober for 33 years, I think now, and he shared about a friend, I think in 10th grade, that came up to him and said, hey, I notice you're not hanging out with me anymore, and I think it's because you're hanging out with all the kids that smoke weed, and I don't smoke weed. Is that it? And that stuck in his mind for years, and when he got ready to get help, he called his friend and said, hey, thank you. That taught me that something was off. I wasn't ready to do anything about it, but it taught me that I was off track, and I appreciate that. So even if our friends don't make a big change right away, if we can do that, we can let them know, I'm here for you, and I'm concerned about you. So I did want to share, two things actually. I did want to share for the parents and caring adults who are in the room some information about what neuroscience or brain science teaches us about setting rules about alcohol and drugs. Largely because that's the number one question that I get when I talk to families. It can be hard, I think, in today's day to say, you know what, I don't want you to drink or use drugs. We can have a lot of fears, like, well, what if they then will keep secrets from me? What if they'll put themselves in more dangerous situations because they want to make sure that they don't get in trouble at home? And I, as a parent myself, don't have any answers to say you should do this or that. I don't believe in that, actually. I think it's a very personal decision for every family what their rules are going to be. I will say this. When we look at the neuroscience research and the leaders who really focus on teenage brains and what helps them to get to adulthood in a healthy and safe way, one of the things that they say is that having boundaries around substance use, as in, we have a family rule that I expect you not to drink or use drugs, helps kids to stay off of alcohol and drugs. So if we have those rules, it can be helpful to say, here are the benefits you'll experience if you stay abstinent, like you get to get your driver's license, or you get to keep your cell phone, or you get to go on the spring break trip you want to go on maybe. I don't know. For every family, it's going to be different. And then also, by the way, if I find out that you've been drinking or using, these are the consequences that we'll have to put in place. We'll have to take the cell phone for a week, or we'll whatever is true for your family. But when we have a clear view of what we'll get to experience if we make a certain choice and what we might not want to experience if we do use alcohol or other drugs, it helps us to make a choice to wait. I will say that when I talk with young people, when we talk about how do I say no to drinking or how do I say no to using drugs, the easiest way to say no is to blame it on their parents. To say, oh, you know what? My mom or my dad or my uncle or my aunt told me that if they catch me high, I'm not going to be able to drive, and I'm just up for my license. That is the easiest way to say no. And so those rules can help. Now, what I would say is, again, these are very personal family decisions. I do believe in this, that regardless of what your rules are at home, you should add something on to it if you feel comfortable, which is, and if ever you are in a sticky spot, if ever you need my help, if ever you find yourself struggling with drug use or alcohol use, or you're at a party and feel uncomfortable and it's 3 a.m, even though I told you not to go to a party or you told me you were somewhere else, you will not get in trouble for calling me for help. And I think that's an important piece because sometimes, I don't know, when I was young, I didn't want to do something that would get myself in trouble. I didn't want to reach out for help, even if I needed it, if I thought that I was going to get a lot of heat from it. But we can have rules and also like an amnesty policy that if you truly need help, I will come and I will not, you will not have big punishment if you actually reach out for help. And I think that can make a world of difference because sometimes as parents we worry, if I have these rules, what if they need me? We can let our kids know that if they do need us, we will come and we will take care of them. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is a resource that I think is very, very important to know about, and that is fentanyl test strips. So you may remember lots and lots of drugs in our area have fentanyl in them. And what's interesting, and I'll share a video in a second, when fentanyl is in them, it's not sort of equally distributed in the drug. It can be just, 2 to 3 grains of salt in a big pill or in a big baggie of something is not a lot. So one thing that can be helpful if you are a young person and you're going to use drugs, or if you're an adult and going to use drugs, or if your kids in your neighborhood are using certain substances, even weed, even things that we might consider to be not as dangerous as opioids or fentanyl, using fentanyl test strips is a very helpful tool. So I will say fentanyl test strips are not a guarantee that no fentanyl is present, but they can give, generally, they'll tell you if fentanyl is there. They're just not perfect. And I wanted to show a video of what it actually entails to use fentanyl test strips because I think, again, talking about it without actually saying, what does this mean? What would you do? It doesn't help. Fentanyl test strips are available here in the school district. They're also available for free lots of different places across the county. There's a vending machine at the SRJC where people can get it out without having to give any money. But I wanted to share what you need to do if you were to use fentanyl test strips.
When fentanyl is mixed with other substances, it's never mixed evenly. One portion of a substance may contain no fentanyl, while another may contain a potentially fatal dose of fentanyl, like a chocolate chip cookie may contain chocolate chips in one bite, but not in another. It's best to test everything you plan on using. To use fentanyl test strips, you will need the substance you'd like to test, a clean and dry container like an aluminum cooker or the bag that the substance came in, and a scale, microscope, or other way to measure ideally 10 milligrams of the substance. If you do not have a microscope or scale, 10 milligrams is about the amount that can cover Abraham Lincoln's hair on a penny. Step 1. Place the crushed substance sample in a clean, dry container. You can also test the residue of the container that your substance came in. Step 2. Add sterile water to the container. For methamphetamine and MDMA, use about 1 teaspoon of water per 10 milligrams of powder or crushed crystals. 1 teaspoon is the amount that can fill a soda bottle cap or aluminum cooker. For all other substances, use a half teaspoon of water per 10 milligrams of sample and mix thoroughly. Step 3. Holding the solid blue end of the test strip, Insert the end of the strip that has wavy blue lines into the water. Do not insert past the blue line. Let it absorb for about 15 seconds. Step 4. Remove the strip from the water and place it on a flat surface for 2 to 5 minutes. Then read your results. A single pink line on the right-hand side or no lines at all indicates an invalid test. Retest your substance with a new strip. 2 pink lines indicate that fentanyl or a fentanyl analog has not been detected in your substance. The line closest to the wavy end of the strip may be faint. This is still a negative result. Remember, no test is 100% accurate and your substance may still contain fentanyl or a fentanyl analog. Use caution. When possible, test everything you plan on using. A single pink line means fentanyl or a fentanyl analog has been detected in the substance. This is opposite from how the results are read on other common tests like pregnancy tests or at-home COVID-19 tests. The test detects the presence of fentanyl but does not tell us how much or which analog of fentanyl is present. Fentanyl strip testing does not destroy your substances. After testing, you can drink them or wait until the water evaporates to use them. You won't lose the substance you are testing. To reduce the risk of overdose, have someone with you when using or use the Never Use Alone hotline. Keep naloxone nearby. Start low and go slow, and try to avoid mixing substances.
So I wanted to share that not because I expect anyone to remember all those steps, but I do think it's sometimes we can talk about things and they're kind of mysterious, like get and use fentanyl test strips. Or if we're planning to talk to someone that we care about, we could say fentanyl test strips will help. But if we don't know what that actually entails, it's hard to have a meaningful conversation about it. And so what I would say is that I think really important conversations to have, now whether that's with friends, if you're all considering or actively using certain drugs, whether that's with young people in our lives or other people in our community, I think it's important to talk about, well, how would somebody use a fentanyl test strip? And I will say for myself, this is my job. I do drug prevention. And I thought maybe fentanyl test strip a long time ago, you just like stuck it in the drug and found out what happened. And if somebody does that, it won't work, right? You have to mix it, you have to do all of these things. And so I think that the more that we can take the mystery out of some of these procedures, the more that we can be really direct and upfront about some of the tools that are available, I would much rather someone that I care about in my life use fentanyl test strips or have Narcan by their side with a friend if they're going to try a substance for the first time than not have any of those tools at all. And so whereas in the past, maybe we would think about prevention being only staying off of substances, I think when we think about opioids and fentanyl, effective prevention is also talking about harm reduction, which is tools that we can use to keep ourselves safe if we do decide to use substances. And so I'm just like loving families that I'm seeing here together tonight and just loving, folks that are here. I think it's really important that we talk about all of this because it could be that little nugget of information that saves the life of someone we care about. Because with fentanyl, that is the true risk, is that we'll just continue to lose more people that we love in our community. So I wanted to take a moment to see, and I know there aren't a ton of us here in person, but I do believe in getting to ask questions or raise what's on our minds and be able to talk together. What I would say is if you're watching via video, I am very happy to have questions sent my way if it's something that isn't school related. But does anyone have any questions or things that are on their minds that would be helpful to talk about together? Yes. Yeah, thank you. There was some feedback that from Matt, thank you, Matt, that, you know, mentioning, being willing to say, hey, call me if you're stuck makes a difference. And even having to do it, I don't think anybody wants to get up at 3 in the morning or anybody wants to get those calls. But again, what we're teaching our kids or even friends, if like you're someone who's not impaired and you're saying, hey, you need me, call me, I'll get you help. That's the thing that makes a world of difference. And sometimes calls for help don't come at convenient times. Very rarely do they come at a convenient time, but those are the things that let our kids know and our friends know, I'm here to help you stay safe. And I'm not going to punish you for asking for help. And when I think about that, especially when I think about how much courage it takes if you're struggling with addiction or a substance use problem to say, hey, I need some help here. When we can communicate in other ways, I'm not going to punish you for needing help. That's what opens the door for the bigger things too, where our kids or our friends will know they can trust us. I can let you in on this problem that I'm struggling with that I cannot solve by myself. Right. Any other questions? No? Okay. So what I do want to say is thank you. Oh, yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is a great question. I'm just going to repeat it for the folks who are on video. But the question was, with Narcan being available, is that something that adolescents can get? Absolutely. And the great thing about Narcan is it's not harmful. It's not going to hurt anyone if it's not used properly. The places that adolescents can get it, they can get it from their pediatrician. They can get it from a variety of places in like community health centers. There are also places where you could order it to come to your home in the mail and give it to your adolescent. But the laws that are in place, largely because of the concern of overdose risk, say, adolescents can get it. They don't have to have their parents even be informed that they're asking for Narcan. And it's most often free, if not always free now. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Matt. Mm-hmm. That's a good question that I don't. So the question actually was, is Narcan temperature sensitive? Like, does it have to be at like a certain temperature to work? I've never heard guidance that you can't have it with you anywhere. And a lot of places I've seen it stored are not temperature controlled. So I think, but I see, you may have a response to that. Okay. Okay. So there's, yeah. So thank you. So we did get an answer, not for me, but the not in excessive heat. So probably not baking in the glove compartment of our car. But I have heard, have it on hand, have it in your pocket, have it in your purse, have it in your backpack. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So something that was shared is let people know you have it. Yes. And I think that there's something comforting about saying like, hey, I know this is going on and I'm showing up to help. And, I have had conversations with parents where they've said that to their kids and said, listen, I want you to know I've got Narcan here. Again, I don't want you using drugs, but I know reality is that sometimes people do, or maybe your friends will. And if ever any of you need help or there's a concern, let me know. I'm prepared. I think also when I talk to young people, like the teenagers that are in the room, when I talk to schools and students at school, I think it's a really valuable conversation about how do you get Narcan, or can I take you to get Narcan? Would you like access to Narcan? Because most of the students that I know that I talk with, will say, yeah, I know about Narcan, but the extra steps to actually get it are hard, you know? And most teenagers I speak with, if they're at a party and something happens, they want to be able to help, whether or not they're using substances. And so, most high schools have had an overdose, whether that's on campus. I'm not saying this school, but most that I've presented at, I don't think so at this school, but, or an overdose in community. And young people, they're concerned about that. So if we can help get Narcan in their hands, that's also valuable. Yes, Matt? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Matt Marshall was sharing that in every school site at Cotati-Roanoke Park School District, there is Narcan on site in the nurse's office and in every AED device, which I love. Because when we think of emergency, those, AEDs, sort of like if someone has a heart attack, we can save their life devices. Having life-saving equipment together just helps our brain. Because in a time of emergency, we often don't think clearly. And quite honestly, it is new that we might encounter an overdose in our schools. That hasn't been the norm for a very long time. And so having things in convenient places is important. And I might say it's worth sharing if you're an adult in this room or if you're a teen in this room with friends or with your kids, that should you be worried about someone on site, there's Narcan at your school, right? Ask a teacher. They will know where to get it, right? That's really important. Any other questions or feedback or things that would be helpful to talk about? Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. There's some gratitude for the presentation and also just hope that the more of our community, more parents, more students will get this information. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. And what I would say is that when I present to teens at school, it is very much on their minds. And often I'll say, who has heard of Narcan? Everybody puts their hand up. Who knows how to get Narcan? 2 people put their hands up. Who's heard of fentanyl test strips? Everybody says yes. Who knows how to use them? Nobody knows. And so that information is really important. That's part of why I wanted to share it today, because we can talk about it, but actual how to do it, I think, is important. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'll answer. The question was, am I a psychologist and am I able to provide my information? First of all, thank you for appreciating this information enough to ask. That means a lot to me. I am a psychologist, and I don't do therapy anymore, but I'm going to put my email address up. If anyone has questions or wants resources or information, I would be glad to share. And you can email me directly. And if you are watching and don't write my email address down. Whoops. Sorry. Here we go. It's sarah@panoptic.com. But also, I think a really tremendous resource at Cotati-Roanoke Park School Unified is Matt Marshall, who's would be a wonderful person who knows a lot of the resources and information here. And you can also point people to me if they send you questions, Matt. I'd be happy to answer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think the feedback is there's a lot of resources on the website, on the district website, but also if you are a student, if you are a parent, speaking to a teacher or a counselor or anyone at school is really, really important. And what I would want to say for those of you who are students who may be listening here or watching, that support can be confidential for you. And so it's the best, you know, when we're suffering and struggling, it's really hard to reach out for help, but the sooner we do it, the more we can change things around faster. So definitely the resources here, I would recommend taking advantage of. So, great. All right. Well, I want to thank you all, one, for being here or for watching, but two, in my heart, the reason that I do this work is because I know that the more of us that learn about this important information, the more of us that find ways to have these conversations that I'm talking about that are never easy, they're never simple, but even awkward conversations, even uncomfortable conversations about substance use, they save lives. They can save your friends' lives, they can save your kids' lives, or kids in our community. So thank you for taking the time to learn and be here together. Yes? Great. And this presentation is being recorded live on YouTube, and the link to it will be on the district website, I think, in a day or two. Great. Thank you. And I'll be here for those who are in person. If anybody has any questions, I'll be here for a bit too. But thank you all so much. It's a gift to meet you. Thank you.